March 26, 1993, Eisenhower Expressway at Wolf Road, Hillside, Illinois. A van pulls alongside a black Oldsmobile heading back toward Chicago's west side. The side door slides open. Gunfire tears across the lanes. The shooters believe Willie, King of Kings Lloyd, is inside. He is not. His driver is hit. His 2-year-old son is in the car. So is the boy's aunt. In seconds, the illusion of control is gone. This is not a rival gang making a move. Not yet. This is something worse. A revolt from inside the house. The day before, Lloyd had allegedly ordered one of his own top lieutenants, Cardell Williams, kidnapped and held for ransom over missing drug money. That decision crossed a line even street empires understood. Tribute was expected. Fear was useful. But humiliating your own command structure was different. It turned obedience into vengeance. The expressway ambush was not the beginning of Willie Lloyd's collapse. It was the first public sign that his kingdom had already cracked from within. From that moment on, the West Side would not be ruled by discipline. It would be ruled by retaliation. And every man under Lloyd would have to decide whether he still served a king or whether the king had become the problem. Before Willie Lloyd became a headline, he was a product of a specific machine, the West Side of Chicago in the 1960s and 1970s, where gangs were not just neighborhood crews, but parallel governments. The Vice Lords had already grown into one of the city's most powerful street organizations, with factions, ranks, territory, and a language of discipline that mimicked legitimacy while feeding on fear. Lloyd emerged from that world early, hard, ambitious, and already marked by incarceration as a teenager. Men who knew him then remembered not charm, but menace. Not chaos either, control. Even at a young age, he projected the cold self-belief of someone who did not want a place in the structure. He wanted to sit above it. His legend grew because prison did not bury him. It refined him. Lloyd had already been convicted in Iowa in 1973 of second-degree murder in the killing of a rookie police officer, and later accumulated additional weapons convictions. By the time he returned to Chicago as an adult power broker, he was no longer just another West Side hustler. He was a man whose biography itself had become currency. Violence gave him reputation. Prison gave him mythology. What made Lloyd dangerous was not simply brutality, it was organization. Police later described him as the chief of the unknown Vice Lords, a faction that operated less like a loose gang than a command structure built on drug revenue, loyalty payments, intimidation, and symbolic power. On the West Side, that distinction mattered. Random violence scares a neighborhood. Organized violence governs it. Willie Lloyd did not rise by being the loudest man on the block. He rose by understanding that the modern street empire was not built on rage alone. It was built on structure. Inside the unknown Vice Lords, power flowed upward. Young boys worked corners. Mid-level operators controlled spots, collected cash, and enforced discipline. Trusted lieutenants buffered the boss from the street. And above them sat Lloyd, the chief, demanding tribute from men who risked prison and death while he converted fear into authority. On the West Side, that was the real currency, not just drugs, obedience. What made Lloyd exceptional was his instinct for myth. Police later said he admired the language and image of old-world bosses, even enough for investigators to nickname their long-term case against him Operation Dawn. He surrounded himself with bodyguards. He issued orders like a chief executive. He demanded what investigators described as street taxes from subordinate operations. Even prison did not silence him. According to the Chicago Tribune, he ran parts of his organization remotely, speaking by phone to underlings, directing business, and preserving the illusion that confinement did not reduce power, it purified it. That was the genius and the weakness of Lloyd's rise. He turned a faction into a kingdom by making himself larger than the faction. But empires built around one man carry a hidden flaw. The higher the throne, the more dangerous the distance between the ruler and the men expected to feed it. The turning point came disguised as a coronation. In December 1992, Willie Lloyd walked out of Logan Correctional Center and returned to Chicago like a ruler reclaiming occupied ground. 5 limousines waited at the gate, leather, fur, jewelry. The spectacle was deliberate. It told the West Side that prison had not diminished him. It had elevated him. Police already believed he intended to consolidate vice lord power and pull more of the West Side drug trade under his personal dominion. The performance was not vanity alone. It was strategy. In organized crime, image is enforcement by other means. But the same display that strengthened the myth also exposed the weakness beneath it. Lloyd came home demanding money, loyalty, and submission from lieutenants who had grown used to earning without him. Men who had once accepted tribute as part of the order now saw it as extraction. Police later said he was all take and no give. That is how bosses begin to lose the room, not when they become feared, but when fear stops feeling profitable. Then came the fatal overreach. In March 1993, Lloyd allegedly ordered Lieutenant Cardell Williams kidnapped over $6,000 in disputed drug money. Cardell's brother, Tyrone Williams, allegedly paid with a Mercedes. The next day, the Williams faction struck back on the Eisenhower Expressway, trying to kill Lloyd in broad daylight. They missed their target, but they hit something more important, the fiction that the empire was still one body. From that point forward, Willie Lloyd was no longer managing a kingdom. He was standing inside a civil war. By 1993, Willie Lloyd's war was no longer just a gang problem. It had become a civic problem, a policing problem, a political problem. Because what was happening on the West Side was not random street violence spilling out of poverty. It was a revenue system. Drug corners were being taxed. Territory was being defended like commercial property. Young men were being used as labor, security, and expendable soldiers. That distinction changed everything. Chicago authorities began to argue that these factions were not merely gangs in the old juvenile sense. They were organized criminal enterprises, driven by narcotics money, intimidation, extortion, and murder. That shift in language mattered. Once Lloyd's faction was seen as an enterprise, law enforcement stopped chasing individual shootings and started targeting the hierarchy. Investigators later said they chose a proactive strategy instead of a reactive one. Not just patrol the corners after bodies dropped, build upward, penetrate the structure, record the transactions, follow the money and the chain of command. Because the real scandal was not simply that boys were dying in the street, it was that an entire neighborhood had been bent around a private system of rule. That is where Lloyd's own ambition helped trigger the state response. Police intelligence suggested he intended to unify vice lord factions and consolidate West Side drug traffic under his control after his 1992 release. To investigators, that meant one thing. If they waited, his influence would spread faster than the cases against him. So they built what became known as Operation Dawn, named after Lloyd's admiration for the Godfather. It was a deliberate insult, but also an admission. The city was no longer treating him like a neighborhood nuisance. It was treating him like a crime boss. By March 1994, Lloyd was also pulled into a broader federal moment. His gun prosecution was folded into a joint effort by local, state, and federal authorities under the Justice Department's anti-violent crime push announced by Attorney General Janet Reno. That detail matters because it shows how the state had changed its posture. The old Chicago pattern had been containment. Watch them, manage them, survive them. The new posture was removal. Decapitate leadership, break the command structure, make the boss spend his authority fighting the government while his own men were already turning against him. After the Expressway ambush, Willie Lloyd was still alive, but survival was beginning to look like weakness. A boss can recover from an attack by rivals. That can even strengthen his legend. But an attack ordered by men from inside his own structure does something worse. It exposes the arithmetic behind power. It tells every earner, every runner, every young gun on the corner that the throne is no longer protected by loyalty, only by momentum, and momentum can be reversed. On the West Side, that kind of knowledge spread faster than rumor. It spread like permission. Lloyd responded the way compromised rulers often do. He tightened his perimeter. He moved carefully. Police said he grew tired of surveillance around his West Side property and secretly relocated to a motel in Deerfield. When he came back into the city, he traveled with escorts, bodyguards, advance cars, and tail cars. The message was supposed to be strength. In reality, it was fear made visible. A man who once embodied territorial certainty was now moving like an exile through his own kingdom. Then the internal war kept escalating. Lloyd's faction and the Williams faction allegedly began robbing each other's drug operations. Men who had once shared the same ladder were now cutting away its steps. Even in court, the lines blurred. Gang leaders appeared one day as victims, the next day as defendants. That is what betrayal does inside organized crime. It destroys the distinction between discipline and revenge. Publicly, Lloyd still wore the image of command. Privately, the structure beneath him was hollowing out. And once a criminal empire begins consuming itself, the final act is never far behind. Every criminal empire eventually reveals what it values most. Not in speeches, not in symbols, in bodies. By September 1993, the war inside Willie Lloyd's empire had stopped looking like a dispute over tribute and respect. It had become a struggle for succession. Lloyd's faction and the Williams faction were no longer maneuvering around each other. They were stripping each other's operations, robbing drug spots, and sending messages in blood. Over just 2 days, September 12th to September 14th, the West Side Territory claimed by the unknown vice lords erupted. 4 people were murdered, 3 more were wounded. This was not random street heat. It was an internal purge spilling into public view. The organization was no longer protecting the business was driving the killings. Then came the moment that defined the collapse. 2 teenage boys working a drug location believed to be tied to Lloyd's operation were seized by men from the warring faction. A witness later said the boys began to cry as they were forced into a car. They were driven away from the corner economy that had used them and taken near the railroad tracks at 2501 West Roosevelt Road. There, according to police accounts cited by the Chicago Tribune, they were dragged through the weeds and killed despite pleading for their lives. It was murder, but it was also communication. The message was clear. Lloyd could no longer protect the people working under his name. His authority had become an invitation to die. That is the hidden truth of organized crime leadership. Publicly, the boss speaks in the language of order, loyalty, and family. Privately, the machine consumes the youngest and the weakest first. The teenagers at the bottom carry the risk, while the men at the top speak of honor. In Lloyd's world, that contradiction had always existed, but now it was impossible to hide. The Civil War had reached the rank-and-file children of the system, and once that happens, the empire is already dead. It may still collect money, it may still carry weapons, it may still inspire fear, but it no longer governs, it only devours. Even Lloyd's own conduct showed the rot. The Tribune reported that he did not attend the boys' funeral and did not contribute to their burial. Whether out of fear or calculation, the effect was the same. A king who cannot bury his own dead is no longer a king. He is a man waiting for the structure around him to finish collapsing. The end did not come with one final shootout. It came with paperwork, warrants, and doors kicked in at dawn. On April 13, 1994, after more than a year of infiltration, surveillance, taped drug buys, and hierarchy mapping, roughly 150 officers moved across 16 locations and arrested 29 upper-echelon members of the unknown vice lords. The operation was designed to do what street violence had not done cleanly: remove the command structure all at once. By then, Lloyd's empire was already bleeding from internal war. The state simply finished what betrayal had started. Lloyd himself was pulled back into prison through a federal gun case. A jury convicted him in 1994 of being a felon in possession of a firearm, and he received a substantial sentence. The image was almost cruel in its symmetry. The man who had stepped out of prison in mink and leather, escorted by limousines, was now reduced to khaki and lockup routine. The mythology survived longer than the machine, but not by much. And that is the real fallout. The kingdom did not disappear in glory. It collapsed into evidence. In the end, Willie Lloyd's story is not just the story of one vice lord boss on Chicago's West Side. It is the story of what organized crime becomes when it tries to impersonate government. Lloyd did not rule through affection. He ruled through structure, tribute, mythology, and selective violence. That is why men followed him for so long. He offered what broken neighborhoods often make precious: certainty, a chain of command, a code, a promise that fear could be organized and therefore controlled. But criminal power always carries a contradiction inside it. It borrows the language of order while feeding on disorder. It speaks of loyalty while rewarding betrayal. It claims to protect the neighborhood while living off its decay. That contradiction is what destroyed his kingdom. Not simply police pressure, not simply federal prosecution, not even the violence of rival factions. Willie Lloyd helped break his own empire by violating the hidden rule that keeps these underworld hierarchies alive. A boss may demand obedience, but he cannot humiliate the men whose obedience sustains him. The moment tribute becomes naked extraction, the moment discipline becomes personal appetite, the moment the ruler starts consuming his own command structure, the machine turns inward. That is what happened in 1993. The kidnapping allegation, the internal revolt, the murders, the boys dragged to the tracks. By the time the state arrived with warrants and organized cases, the spiritual collapse had already happened. There is also a political lesson buried in the ruins. Cities often talk about gangs as if they are eruptions of senseless evil. But Lloyd's rise came from real conditions: neglected blocks, broken institutions, prison culture, drug economies, and a vacuum of authority on the West Side. Men like him do not appear in spite of collapse. They appear because collapse creates a market for rulers. That does not absolve them. It makes them legible. Willie Lloyd was not a glitch in the system. He was one of its dark products, a man who learned that in abandoned places, domination can pass for leadership. And so the story circles back to that expressway in March 1993. A van sliding alongside a car. Gunfire cracking across daylight. Men trying to kill a king they no longer believed in. That was the perfect image of the whole empire. Motion without safety. Power without trust. A kingdom so brittle that even its ceremonies of protection, the escorts, the bodyguards, the mythology, could not shield it from what had already entered the bloodstream. In the underworld, collapse rarely begins when the bullets fly. It begins earlier, in silence, when the men closest to the throne stop believing the throne is sacred. Willie Lloyd survived prisons, prosecutions, and assassination attempts, but survival is not the same as victory. That is the final darkness in stories like this. The boss imagines he is building something permanent, a nation, a dynasty, a code. In truth, he is often building a chamber that will one day echo back his own methods against him. And when that echo returns, it does not sound like glory. It sounds like a car door sliding open on a gray morning, and a kingdom realizing too late that it has taught everyone inside it exactly how to kill a king.